Humiliated, alone. The gallery lights blurred as Grace stood accused, her sister's fate threatened by a ruthless mentor. Then he appeared, the enigmatic Mafia boss who'd been watching her, a silent shadow in her darkest hour. He didn't offer help. He unleashed a devastating vengeance, publicly claiming her, dismantling her tormentor, declaring her his stolen canvas. But is she truly saved, or just trapped by his dark obsession? The scent of lemon polish and stale, expensive perfume was a permanent backdrop to Grace Miller's existence. Each morning, it clung to her uniform, a drab charcoal dress that swallowed her slender frame, making her feel as insubstantial as the dust motes dancing in the gallery's sunbeams. For 24 years, Grace had harbored a secret world of vibrant colors and raw emotion, meticulously poured onto canvases hidden in her tiny, drafty apartment. But here, at the prestigious Ethelred Gallery, she was simply Grace, the assistant. The girl who polished pedestals until her fingertips ached, who served lukewarm champagne to patrons who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Her days bled into one another, a monotonous rhythm of hushed whispers and clinking ice. Today was no different, save for the dull, persistent throb behind her eyes. Another medical bill for her younger sister, Lily, had arrived that morning, a cruel white envelope tucked amongst the junk mail. The numbers swam, blurring the edges of her already precarious reality. Lily's laughter, once so bright, was now punctuated by the rasp of chronic illness, and Grace, the fierce protector, felt herself drowning in a sea of helplessness. She could paint a sunset that bled fire across the canvas, but she couldn't conjure a cure or the funds to pay for one. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She ran a soft cloth over cold, polished marble of a plinth, the chill seeping into her skin. Each antique statue, each contemporary sculpture, seemed to mock her, silent monuments to a world of beauty and excess she could only serve, never truly belong to. Patrons, adorned in diamonds and bespoke suits, drifted past, their conversations a meaningless hum, their gazes sliding over her like water. Invisible. It was a word that had become a comfort, a shield, but also a suffocating weight. To be unseen was to be safe, but it was also to be irrelevant. A tremor sharper than usual ran through her as a familiar, predatory energy seeped into the gallery. Julian Thorne. The name alone was a barbed wire fence around her heart. Her former mentor, the man who had once praised her talent, was now the architect of her quiet despair. He entered the gallery, his tailored gray suit a stark contrast to the muted tones of her day. His smile, usually charming to the wealthy, tightened into something cold and knowing when his eyes, the color of cheap whiskey, found her. That smile promised retribution, a subtle reminder of the crushing debt he held over her family, a debt that grew heavier with each passing week. He wasn't just a lone shark. He was a viper, coiled and waiting. He paused near a towering abstract painting, pretending to admire it, but his gaze kept flicking back to Grace. She could feel it, a physical pressure on her skin, raising goosebumps despite the warmth of the room. He was a constant, gnawing presence, a shadow stretching from her past, threatening to consume her future. He represented everything she had tried to escape, the suffocating control, the condescending pity, the slow erosion of her dignity. He had nurtured her artistic aspirations only to exploit her vulnerability, transforming her passion into a bargaining chip. Her fingers, stained faintly with charcoal from a desperate sketching session last night, tightened around the cleaning cloth. The faint, sweet smell of turpentine on her clothes, usually a source of secret comfort, now felt like a glaring beacon, inviting his scrutiny. She longed for the anonymity of the subway, the chaos of the city streets where she could blend in, disappear. But even there, her thoughts were haunted by Lily's fading smile, by the mountain of bills, by Thorne's chilling threats. She moved towards the back of the gallery, seeking refuge among the less frequented exhibits, her footsteps soft against the gleaming parquet floor. Each step was an effort, her exhaustion a heavy cloak. The elegant chandeliers above cast a deceptive glow, making everything appear pristine, perfect. But beneath the surface, Grace felt the rot, the decay of her own hopes and dreams slowly succumbing to the weight of circumstance. Her art, her escape, felt like a distant, fading star. She imagined herself painting, brushstrokes bold and fearless, but the image dissolved, replaced by the stark reality of her empty bank account. The gallery manager, a stern woman with a permanent scowl, barked an instruction about preparing for the evening's private viewing. Another event, another parade of the privileged, another reminder of her place in the world. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper, the sound lost in the vastness of the room. Her shoulders slumped, a weariness settling deep into her bones. Thorne's presence, though distant, felt like a tightening noose. He wasn't just observing, he was calculating. He was waiting for the opportune moment to strike, to crush what little spirit she had left. He knew her weaknesses, her desperation, and he relished in wielding them against her. As dusk began to seep through the tall windows, casting long dramatic shadows across the polished floor, a palpable shift occurred in the gallery's atmosphere. The hushed tones grew more eager, the air crackled with anticipation. Tonight was no ordinary viewing. A rare, ancient marble bust was to be unveiled, a masterpiece expected to fetch an astronomical sum. Grace felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Such high-stakes events always brought out the most demanding patrons, the most aggressive bidders, and the most dangerous players. And tonight, with Thorne's predatory gaze still a phantom touch on her back, she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her fragile world was about to be irrevocably shattered. The abyss she was teetering on the edge of threatened to pull her under. The Ethelred Gallery, usually a sanctuary of hushed reverence, was throbbing with an artificial pulse that night. Crystal chandeliers dripped liquid light onto a throng of New York's elite, their laughter tinkling like loose change, their jewels glinting with hungry avarice. The air thick with the scent of expensive champagne, rare orchids, and ambition felt heavy, suffocating Grace. She moved through the crowd like a phantom, her drab uniform a stark protest against the shimmering gowns and tailored suits. Every clink of a glass, every raised voice, grated on her already frayed nerves. Her head pounded, a relentless drumbeat against the lingering anxiety from Thorne's earlier visit. He was here tonight, she knew, somewhere in this glittering maze, a viper among the pearls. Her task was simple: circulate with trays of champagne, offer a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, and remain, as always, utterly invisible. But invisibility felt like a flimsy shield tonight. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she navigated a perilous path between a particularly boisterous cluster of brokers and a precarious display of antique porcelain. Lily's face, pale and tired, flashed behind her eyelids. The medical bills, heavy and unforgiving, were a constant whisper in her ear, drowning out the shallow chatter around her. She was exhausted, bone-weary, yet the adrenaline of impending disaster kept her wired, a taut string on the verge of snapping. Suddenly, a sharp elbow from a departing socialite caught her side. The tray tilted violently. Time seemed to slow. Her breath hitched. The champagne glasses teetered, then cascaded downwards, a miniature avalanche of shattering crystal and golden liquid. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate vicinity. But Grace's gaze wasn't on the shards littering the Persian rug. It was locked in horrifying slow motion on the centerpiece of the evening, an ancient Greek marble bust, pristine and fragile, perched on a gleaming obsidian pedestal. The falling glasses had struck the pedestal. The bust, a serene face carved from impossibly white stone, swayed, a sickening, elegant dance of doom. A choked cry tore from Grace's throat. Instinct, desperate and illogical, propelled her forward. She lunged, an outstretched hand trying to brace the priceless antiquity, to somehow defy gravity and save it. But her fingers, wet with spilled champagne, only grazed the cold, smooth marble. Instead of steadying it, her frantic touch, a smear of golden liquid, marred the bust's immaculate cheek, a single, devastating streak across its ancient perfection. The moment her hand connected, the bust shivered, then settled back, seemingly unharmed, but with the stark, glaring evidence of her mistake. A gasp of relief, then a wave of crushing humiliation washed over her. Then the world tilted. A silence descended, thick and instantaneous, like a velvet curtain dropping. It wasn't just the shock of the broken glasses or the narrowly averted disaster of the bust. It was him, Rogero Conti. He emerged from the shadows of a towering, dramatic painting, not walking, but seeming to materialize. His suit, a bespoke creation of dark, expensive fabric, was so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin, accentuating the dangerous breadth of his shoulders. His hair, dark and impeccably styled, framed a face carved from granite, sharp angles, a strong jawline and eyes. His eyes were the color of obsidian, cold and utterly devoid of warmth, yet burning with an unnerving, almost predatory intensity. They swept over the broken glass, over the champagne puddle, over the defaced marble bust, and finally landed on Grace. She froze, a deer caught in the headlights. The humid gallery air suddenly felt glacial, piercing through her thin uniform. His gaze was a physical touch, pinning her, dissecting her, stripping away her carefully constructed invisibility. It wasn't just anger she saw, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. It was something colder, more analytical, yet laced with a dangerous, simmering curiosity. He was assessing her not as a clumsy assistant, but as a problem, or perhaps a puzzle. He didn't speak, didn't move, yet his presence consumed the entire space, radiating a raw, undeniable power that made the air crackle. She felt a shiver of primal fear, a warning bell clanging in her core. He was not just rich, he was formidable, a force of nature cloaked in silk and steel. Then, from the periphery of her terror, she saw him. Julian Thorne. He stood a few feet away, sipping from a fresh glass of champagne, his lips curved into a slow, venomous smile. His eyes, fixed on Grace, gleamed with cruel satisfaction, a silent, triumphant laugh that promised even greater misery. He reveled in her humiliation, already calculating how this fresh disaster could be twisted to his advantage. The knowledge that both men, a predator from her past and a terrifying enigma from her present, were now observing her, shredding her composure, was almost too much to bear. Rogero Conti's gaze, still fixed on Grace, lingered on the champagne smudge on the bust. A flicker, barely perceptible, passed through his eyes, not disgust, but a strange, possessive interest. He had come here for the bust, for a piece of ancient history, but now his attention had been irrevocably stolen by the trembling, humiliated woman who stood before it. The gallery hummed again, a wave of nervous whispers replacing the previous silence. Grace could feel the weight of their judgment, but more acutely, the searing intensity of Rogero's stare. It was an unspoken declaration, a silent claim. She swallowed, her throat dry, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The accident, the humiliation, Thorne's gleeful malice, it all coalesced into one terrifying truth. Her carefully guarded world, her desperate attempt at invisibility, had just spectacularly imploded. And the enigmatic man with the dark, piercing eyes, the one whose presence radiated an unsettling magnetism, was now a witness. A silent, dangerous witness. His lips remained a thin, unyielding line, but his eyes, as they swept over her one last time before moving towards the still pristine bust, held a silent, chilling promise. He hadn't said a word, but Grace knew. Her life, already on the precipice, had just been irrevocably caught in the gravitational pull of Rogero Conti's dark, powerful orbit. She was no longer invisible. And that thought, terrifyingly, was only the beginning. The raw sting of champagne in her eyes was nothing compared to the searing humiliation Grace felt. The Ethelred Gallery, once a sanctuary of quiet artistry, now felt like an execution chamber under the harsh, unblinking glare of 100 judgmental eyes. The fractured silence after the marble incident had given way to a cacophony of hushed whispers, each syllable a shard of glass piercing her already wounded pride. She stood, trembling, the pristine bust now a grotesque monument to her spectacular failure, the champagne smudge a damning crimson across its white perfection in her mind's eye. The lingering scent of crushed orchids and judgment clung to her, suffocating. Then Julian Thorne made his move. He glided through the parting crowd, his smile no longer just satisfied but overtly predatory. "Grace, darling," he purred, his voice dripping with false concern, yet carrying enough venom to freeze the blood in her veins. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough for her to catch the cloying sweetness of his expensive cologne. "Such a clumsy display. I always knew you lacked the finesse for this world." His eyes, dark and glittering, swept over her, stripping her bare of any remaining dignity. "A pity, really. Especially with your precarious situation." The words were an icy blade, twisted expertly. He leaned in, his voice dropping just loud enough for a few curious onlookers to catch, but still a conspiratorial whisper. "The full amount, Grace. Due immediately. Or perhaps I'll pay a visit to your sister. A little chat about where all your hard-earned money really goes." A gasp hitched in Grace's throat, sharp and painful. Lily. He was threatening Lily. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a desperate, frantic drum. The world spun, colors blurring into a nauseating kaleidoscope. Fear, cold and absolute, wrapped around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She opened her mouth to protest, to beg, but no sound escaped. Her voice, usually soft, felt caught, tangled in the tight knot of terror. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the condemnation of the gallery's elite. Thorne was enjoying this, savoring every drop of her despair. He had orchestrated this public shaming, feeding on her vulnerability like a parasite. "Ah, I don't have it," she finally managed, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. The words tasted like ash. Thorn chuckled, a low malicious sound. "Then I suggest you find it, dear girl. Quickly. Or the only canvas you'll be seeing is the sterile white wall of a charity ward for your ailing sister." He paused, letting the full weight of his threat sink in, watching her face crumble. "Think of it as poetic justice. You ruined a masterpiece. Now your life and your little sister's will be equally unraveled." With a final chilling smile, he turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving Grace standing alone in the epicenter of her shattered world. Her knees felt weak, threatening to buckle beneath her. She felt like a delicate glass figurine, dropped and shattered. The next few days were a blur of frantic, desperate activity. Grace worked extra shifts, cleaning art studios late into the night, the faint smell of turpentine and oil paints offering little comfort against the gnawing dread. She packed up her own canvases, her secret world, and visited small, independent galleries, hoping for a miracle. Each rejection was a fresh wound, a confirmation of her insignificance. "Nice work, but not unique enough, too raw, doesn't fit our aesthetic." The words echoed in the empty halls of her self-worth. She scrubbed harder, painted faster, slept less, chasing a future that seemed to recede with every breath. Lily's coughs, though distant, reverberated in her mind, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. The pressure was suffocating. One dreary afternoon, as rain lashed against her apartment window, blurring the already gray cityscape, Grace received an unexpected call. It was from a discreet art agency, one she barely remembered submitting her portfolio to. They informed her that several of her previously rejected pieces had been acquired by an anonymous collector. Not one, but several. Her heart, a weary, battered thing, gave a faint, hopeful flutter. It wasn't enough to cover Thorne's monstrous debt, not even close, but it was a sliver of validation, a whisper that perhaps she wasn't entirely invisible. The warmth of the news was fleeting, however, quickly overshadowed by the chilling knowledge of Thorne's looming deadline. A week after the gallery incident, a crisp, pristine envelope arrived at her apartment, bearing the elegant, embossed crest of the Conti Corporation. Inside was a formal summons. Rogero Conti required her presence at his private estate for an urgent art-related matter. Grace stared at the invite, suspicion mingling with a fragile, dangerous curiosity. The man who had silently witnessed her public breakdown now wanted to see her? It felt like a trap, a gilded, opulent trap. But the memory of Thorne's threats, the image of Lily's tired face, pushed her forward. She had no choice. His estate was a fortress of glass and steel, nestled amid sprawling, manicured gardens that felt alien and untamed in the heart of New York. The gates, wrought iron masterpieces, hummed open silently as her Uber approached, swallowing her into a world of impenetrable wealth. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive. She was led through echoing corridors, past original masterpieces that dwarfed anything in the Ethelred Gallery, until she reached his private study. The room was vast, dominated by a massive, polished mahogany desk. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient tomes and rare art books. A faint masculine scent of aged leather and something sharper, more elemental, permeated the air. And then she saw him. Rogero Conti stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, silhouetted against the stormy, gray sky. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a dark, open-collared shirt that hugged the powerful lines of his shoulders. The casual attire did nothing to diminish his formidable aura. If anything, it amplified it, revealing a dangerous, untamed edge. He turned slowly, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving intensity. They were the coldest eyes she had ever seen, yet they held a strange, magnetic pull. "Grace Miller," he said, his voice the low, resonant rumble that seemed to fill the vast space, commanding attention without effort. There was no warmth, no pleasantries. Just a stark, direct acknowledgement. Her heart fluttered, a terrified bird beating against the bars of its cage. "Mr. Conti," she managed, her voice a thin thread. "I have a proposition," he continued, walking around the desk. His movements were fluid, economical, like a predator stalking its prey. He gestured to a large, empty easel in the corner. "I require the services of a skilled art restorer for a particularly delicate project. An exclusive, long-term engagement." He paused, his gaze unwavering, dissecting her. "Your reputation precedes you. Despite certain recent incidents, I'm led to believe your artistic aptitude is considerable. Grace blinked. My reputation. The only reputation she had was for clumsiness and debt. Ah, I'm a gallery assistant, Mr. Conti, not a professional restorer. A ghost of a smile, cold and fleeting, touched his lips. Details. I require a unique eye, a steady hand, and absolute discretion. And your hands, I observe, are capable of both delicate work and decisive action. His eyes flickered to her champagne-stained fingers. The subtle reference to her accident was a stark reminder that he had seen everything. He knew. He picked up a slender, encrypted tablet from his desk and held it out to her. The terms are generous. An advance will be transferred immediately upon acceptance. Enough to clear any outstanding obligations. Grace stared at the tablet, then at him. Obligations. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He knew about Thorn. He knew about Lily. He knew everything. The realization sent a chill down her spine, a strange mix of profound relief and unsettling dread. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a rescue, a buyout. A golden cage. Is this a charity, Mr. Conti? She asked, her chin lifting, a desperate attempt to reclaim some dignity. His eyes narrowed, hardening. I do not deal in charity, Miss Miller. I deal in acquisition, in talent, and in control. You are an artist hiding in plain sight. I am offering you the chance to cease hiding, under my terms. Consider it a strategic investment. The advance amount flashed on the screen of the tablet he now held for her to see. It was astronomical. More than enough to pay Thorn to cover Lily's bills for months, years even. A fragile hope blossomed in her chest, quickly choked by the thorny tendrils of suspicion. He wasn't offering salvation. He was offering ownership. She would be bound to him, a piece of his vast, intimidating collection. Yet, what was the alternative? Or ruin. Lily. Her breath hitched. The air in the opulent study felt thick, suffocating. She looked from the staggering numbers on the screen to his implacable, demanding face. The choice, if it could even be called that, was stark. A lifetime of invisible struggle and Thorn's cruel threats, or a life of gilded servitude under the enigmatic, dangerous control of Ruggiero Conti. Ah, I accept, she whispered, the words barely audible. They felt heavy like shackles. A subtle flicker in his eyes, a glint of triumph. Excellent. He extended his hand, his touch firm, possessive, sending a jolt through her. You'll move into the guest suite here at the estate tomorrow. We begin immediately. Grace felt a shiver. Not entirely of fear, but of a strange, unsettling excitement. She had traded one cage for another, perhaps even more luxurious, but infinitely more dangerous. The walls of her new reality were closing in, yet for the first time in a long time, the terrifying possibility of freedom, however constrained, felt within reach. She had entered the lion's den, not as a victim, but as a prize. And Ruggiero Conti, the dark, possessive billionaire, had just claimed his stolen canvas. Tomorrow, her new life, trapped under his unwavering gaze, would truly begin. The guest suite at Ruggiero Conti's estate was a stark, almost blinding contrast to Grace's cramped apartment. Sunlight, filtered through sheer silk curtains, spilled onto floors of polished, light-toned wood. The air, devoid of the city's grime and the stale scent of her old life, smelled faintly of expensive linen and something fresh, almost alpine. It was luxurious, pristine, and utterly impersonal. A golden cage indeed, she thought, running a hand over the impossibly soft duvet of the king-sized bed. Every surface gleamed, reflecting back a distorted image of her own unease. This wasn't home. It was a holding cell of unparalleled comfort. She still felt invisible, only now her invisibility was wrapped in velvet, observed by unseen eyes, her every move implicitly noted. Her new role as Ruggiero's private art restorer was, in practice, less about art and more about immersion into his formidable world. Her days began in his personal studio, a vast, airy space filled with antique tools, rare pigments, and an intimidating silence. The project he had assigned her, the meticulous restoration of a Renaissance altarpiece, was complex, demanding absolute focus. But focusing was hard under the weight of his constant presence. He was often there, seated at a dark, imposing desk across the studio, ostensibly engrossed in documents, yet Grace felt his gaze. It was a subtle, almost subliminal pressure, a prickle on the back of her neck, a tremor in her hands as she mixed her paints. His instructions were always precise, his expectations unwavering. "Attention to detail, Miss Miller," he'd say, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that resonated in the quiet room. "Every stroke counts." His criticisms, though rare, were delivered with surgical precision, dissecting her work with an artist's eye, yet always with the undertone of a powerful CO assessing a subordinate. She hated how he made her feel like a cog in his grand machinery, yet a strange part of her craved his rare nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of her skill. The conflict churned within her, a bitter struggle between resentment and a reluctant admiration for his discerning eye. Mealtimes were an odd affair. She dined alone in a small, elegant dining room adjacent to her suite, served by impeccably trained staff who moved like shadows. Yet sometimes a particular dish would appear, a delicate French pastry she'd once mentioned enjoying, a specific blend of herbal tea for her headaches. Anonymous acts of consideration that felt less like kindness and more like data collection. He knew. He always knew. It sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of feeling cared for and utterly exposed. The subtle scent of the food, the gleaming silverware, the hushed footsteps of the staff, every sensory detail reminded her of the unseen network that observed her. The estate itself was a labyrinth of opulence and silent power. She learned, through discreet observation, that the security was far more advanced than anything she'd ever imagined. Hidden cameras in every corner of the grounds, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, biometric locks on certain doors. This wasn't just a rich man's home. It was a fortress, a bastion of control. And she, Grace, was now inside it, under its protection. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Outside, Thorn still existed, a threat she no longer had to face alone. Inside, Rogero Conthi was the new, dominant force. One evening, while working late in the studio, a sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted. Rain hammered against the vast windows, the sky ripped open by jagged flashes of lightning. Grace, startled, dropped her brush. A sharp crack of thunder made her jump. Rogero, who had been working silently at his desk, looked up. His eyes, usually so devoid of emotion, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "Are you all right, Miss Miller?" His voice was calm, cutting through the roar of the storm. "Yes, Mr. Conthi," she replied, her voice a little shaky. "Just startled." He watched her for a long moment, the flickering studio lights casting stark shadows across his face, making him look even more formidable. "The storm will pass. Finish your work, then retire. My security will ensure the estate remains impenetrable." The words were a command, but also, in their own way, a reassurance. She hated the way a tiny, traitorous part of her felt a profound sense of safety under his unwavering gaze amidst the chaos of the storm. As days turned into weeks, a strange, undeniable chemistry began to develop between them. It wasn't spoken, not directly, but it manifested in the electric silence that often filled the studio. In the way his eyes would linger on her, tracing the line of her concentration as she worked. In the subtle shift of his posture, when she accidentally brushed his arm reaching for a pigment. Her skin would prickle, a flush would creep up her neck, and her heart would give a nervous, unfamiliar thump. She resented it, fought against it with every fiber of her being. He was her captor, her controller, her gilded cage. He was dangerous. Yet the sheer, undeniable force of his presence, his ruthless efficiency, his quiet power, was a siren song to a part of her that had long yearned for protection, for solidity. She found herself observing him, too, searching for cracks in his obsidian shield. The way his jaw would clench when a phone call went south, the almost imperceptible tensing of his hands on his desk when discussing a business rival. This wasn't just about art or business. There was a darker, more intricate world beneath the surface of his perfectly curated life, a world of power plays and hidden threats, glimpsed only in fleeting moments. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this man was capable of terrible things. And yet she also knew, with a growing, bewildering warmth, that those terrible things would never be directed at her, not as long as she remained under his protection. He was a dangerous man, but he was her dangerous man. Grace spent countless nights staring at the ornate ceiling of her guest suite, the silence of the mansion echoing around her. She was safe, truly safe, for the first time in years. Lily's medical bills were being paid. Thorn was a distant, impotent memory. Yet her freedom felt like a fragile illusion, tethered to the whims of a man she barely understood, a man whose dark, possessive gaze seemed to follow her even into her dreams. She was a bird in a gilded cage, her wings clipped not by force, but by comfort so profound it was terrifying. And somewhere, she knew, in the shadows just beyond the estate's formidable walls, the lurking dangers of her past, and perhaps of Rogero's, were still swirling. One morning, as she carefully cleaned a delicate porcelain figurine, a fleeting image of Thorn's cruel smile crossed her mind. She paused, her breath catching. The sense of security, so comforting, suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable. She was under Rogero's protection, yes, but what if that protection drew more, not less, danger to her door? What if the shadows from her past and his were not just outside the walls, but actively seeking a way in? The thought made her heart race, a cold premonition seizing her. She looked up, her eyes instinctively drawn to the empty chair at Rogero's desk. He wasn't there. For the first time, in this impenetrable fortress, she felt a prickle of genuine, unsettling fear, a warning that even a golden cage might not be enough to hold back the encroaching darkness. The rhythm of life within Rogero Conti's estate had begun to lull Grace into a deceptive sense of security. Days were spent in the hushed, sun-drenched studio. The scent of turpentine and old was becoming a new, strange comfort. Her brushstrokes on the Renaissance altarpiece grew more confident, each delicate repair a small victory. The constant hum of wealth and power that permeated the mansion was a low thrum against her skin, no longer a shock, a familiar, unsettling melody. Yet, beneath this gilded tranquility, the specter of Julian Thorn still haunted her, a cold knot in her stomach. She knew he wouldn't simply vanish. Predators rarely did. Her growing unease wasn't entirely unfounded. A subtle shift in the city's art world, a ripple too faint for most to notice, had reached even the insulated walls of the Conti estate. Overheard conversations between staff, hushed phone calls from Rogero's executive assistant, Rebecca, about unforeseen market adjustments in certain gallery sectors, small fragments of a larger, unseen game. Grace, with her artist's sensitivity to nuance, felt the faint tremors. She sometimes saw a particularly pointed glare from a gallery owner she used to greet, a swift turning away from an old acquaintance at a rare public outing with one of Rogero's discreet security details. They were subtle, almost imperceptible rebuffs, but they pricked at her fragile sense of belonging. Julian Thorn, meanwhile, was not a man to suffer perceived losses quietly. Rogero's swift, silent appropriation of Grace had been a direct challenge, a public declaration of ownership that Thorn found intolerable. His own attempts to quietly pressure Grace had met with strange, inexplicable roadblocks. His calls to key art collectors went unreturned. A lucrative deal for a new gallery space mysteriously fell through. The unseen hand of Conti's influence was stifling him, slowly, inexorably. Thorn, a viper-cornered, decided to strike back, aiming directly at what he believed was Grace's weakest point, her artistic reputation and by extension her usefulness to Rogero Conti. He would remind everyone, especially Conti, that Grace Miller was tainted goods. The whispers started insidiously, like a creeping mold. First, an anonymous, scathing review of a minor artist's work appeared online, subtly linking it to a certain new restorer known for questionable methods and even more questionable associations. Then more direct rumors began to circulate in exclusive art circles, suggesting Grace had fabricated parts of her portfolio, that her talent was merely a carefully constructed illusion. One afternoon, while reviewing a digital art journal, Grace stumbled upon a thinly veiled article hinting at the dubious past of newly elevated artists, complete with an old, unflattering photo of her from her struggling days, looking pale and desperate. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She wasn't just invisible anymore. She was maligned. The carefully constructed piece of the estate felt like a fragile bubble, threatening to burst. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. The words on the screen blurred, but the venom behind them was painfully clear. Or it had to be him. He was trying to ruin her, not just professionally, but personally, to prove she was unworthy of Conti's investment. The fear, which had been dormant, now flared, sharp and suffocating. She felt a profound shame, a deep-seated vulnerability that made her skin crawl. The luxury around her suddenly felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how far she'd been pulled into a world she didn't understand, a world where her reputation could be shredded by unseen forces. She closed the tablet with trembling fingers, her eyes fixed on the half-restored altarpiece, its ancient beauty now a stark contrast to the ugliness swirling around her. She didn't mention it to Rogero. How could she? To admit her fear, to confess her vulnerability, felt like a betrayal of the silent agreement they had. She was to be protected, yes, but she also had to be worth protecting. The shame of being publicly attacked, even by proxy, gnawed at her. She worked harder, longer hours, trying to scrub away the metaphorical stains with every stroke of her brush. But the whispers lingered, phantom echoes in the quiet studio, chipping away at her precarious sense of safety. Rogero Conthi, however, was not oblivious. His network was vast, his intelligence gathering surgical. The moment Thorne began his subtle campaign of defamation, Conthi's internal alarms blared. He saw it not as an attack on Grace, but as an audacious challenge to his authority, his property. His cold, calculating anger was a force of nature, contained and focused. Thorne had dared to touch what was his. He didn't speak to Grace about it. He didn't need to. His orders were swift, precise, and utterly ruthless. Financial pressure was applied like a vice. Major art publications that had run Thorne's planted rumors suddenly found their key advertisers pulling out. Galleries associated with Thorne's network faced unexpected audits and regulatory hurdles. Influential critics who had subtly echoed Thorne's narrative found themselves mysteriously blackballed from exclusive events, their access to rare pieces suddenly cut off. It was a silent, bloodless coup, executed with terrifying efficacy. Grace only felt the aftershocks. The critical article online mysteriously disappeared, replaced by a glowing feature about emerging talents and their meticulous craft. The cold shoulders from gallery owners thawed into polite, almost deferential smiles. The vague, dismissive comments ceased, replaced by hushed murmurs of her remarkable skill. The art world, like a vast, complex organism, had simply adjusted. She watched these changes unfold, a strange mix of relief and profound dread churning in her gut. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't mere coincidence. This was Rogero. This was his power. He had moved in the shadows, a silent, deadly protector, reshaping her world with the brutal efficiency of a god. He had cleared her path, eliminated the obstacles, but in doing so, he had also tightened the invisible chains that bound her to him. The cost of her newfound safety was the undeniable knowledge that her life was now entirely at his mercy, protected by a power so vast, so ruthless, that it both terrified and captivated her. One evening, as she finished her work, Rogero entered the studio. He stood by the window, his back to her, watching the city lights glitter in the distance. "The matter with Mr. Thorne's associates has been resolved," he stated, his voice calm, devoid of emotion, yet carrying a chilling finality. He didn't turn, didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Grace's breath hitched. Resolved. The single word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She knew what resolve meant in his world. It wasn't just that Thorne's attacks had stopped. Grace's breath hitched. Resolved. The single word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She knew what resolve meant in his world. It wasn't just that Thorne's attacks had stopped. It was that Thorne himself, or his ability to threaten her, had been utterly neutralized. A fresh wave of fear, cold and stark, washed over her. She was safe, yes, but at what unseen price? She had glimpsed the true, terrifying extent of Rogero Conthi's reach, the depths of his dark, possessive protection. And she realized, with a shiver that traced its way down her spine, that being under his unwavering gaze meant more than just safety. It meant being claimed, body and soul, by a man who would stop at nothing to possess what he deemed his. What else was he capable of to ensure she remained untouched? The thought lingered, a cold premonition, as the silence in the vast studio stretched, pregnant with unspoken power and chilling promises. The vastness of Rogero Conthi's estate, once intimidating, had started to feel almost familiar to Grace. The scent of old money and power, once suffocating, was now merely the air she breathed. Her days in the studio, meticulously restoring the altarpiece, had become a meditative escape, her hands finding solace in the delicate strokes of a brush. Thorne's phantom threats had receded, replaced by the omnipresent, albeit silent, protection of Rogero. Yet the man himself remained an enigma, a formidable force of nature she admired and feared in equal measure. His cold, obsidian eyes revealed nothing, even as they watched her with an unwavering intensity that both unnerved and thrilled her. She knew the surface, the powerful, ruthless exterior, but she yearned, inexplicably, to glimpse what lay beneath. One particularly restless night, sleep refused to claim Grace. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows across her luxurious suite, making the silence feel heavy, pregnant with unspoken secrets. A strange unease prickled at her, a feeling not of fear, but of an inexplicable pull towards the heart of the mansion. She found herself drifting from her room, her footsteps silent on the plush carpets of the deserted hallway. A faint light bled from under the heavy oak door of Rogero's private study, a room she had never dared to approach after hours. Curiosity, a dangerous and irresistible current, tugged her forward. Hesitantly, she pushed the door ajar, the ancient wood groaning softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous space. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper, leather, and a faint, acrid tang of whiskey. Rogero Conthi was there, not at his imposing desk, but slumped in a worn leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, a half-empty glass glinting in his hand. He wasn't dressed in his usual impeccable attire, but in a simple dark t-shirt that stretched across the impressive breadth of his chest, sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful, scarred forearms she'd seen before. His head was tilted back, resting against the worn leather, his eyes closed. But it wasn't the image of a man at rest. His face, usually a mask of control, was etched with a profound weariness, a raw, almost agonizing pain that made her breath catch. In his hand, clutched so tightly his knuckles were white, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It looked utterly out of place in his powerful grip, a relic of fragility in a man of iron. She watched, frozen, as he slowly, almost reverently, lifted the locket to his lips, pressing a kiss to the cold metal, before letting out a slow, shuddering sigh that seemed to tear through the silent room. It was a sound of deep, unutterable grief, so starkly human, so utterly vulnerable, that it shattered the carefully constructed image of the impenetrable, emotionless Conthi. Grace felt a shock ripple through her, a wave of profound, unexpected empathy. This wasn't the ruthless billionaire, the silent protector, the dangerous enigma. This was a man broken by a private sorrow, carrying a burden that seemed to weigh more heavily than his entire empire. She wanted to retreat, to vanish as she always did, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her heart ached with an unfamiliar pang, a desire to reach out, to offer comfort to a man who epitomized cold, hard power. Just as she was about to back away, his eyes snapped open. Obsidian met startled Hazel. There was no anger, no immediate command. Only a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by that familiar, unreadable intensity. He saw her, truly saw her, not as an assistant, but as a witness to his hidden pain. The silence stretched, thick and charged, filled with unspoken questions and raw vulnerability. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Miller," he said, his voice rough, devoid of its usual polished cadence. It was a low growl, laced with a vulnerability she hadn't known he possessed. I couldn't sleep," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "I saw the light. I'm sorry. I'll go." "No." The single word stopped her. He didn't move, just watched her with those dark, piercing eyes. He lifted the locket slightly. "My mother." His voice was barely a whisper, strained, as if the words physically pained him. "She wore this. It was the only thing I had left after they took her." Grace felt a jolt. Took her. He closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of profound anguish crossing his face. My father's world. Rivals. They thought by taking her, they could break him. They succeeded. He never truly recovered. Neither did I. He opened his eyes, staring at her, a raw, aching honesty in their depths that stripped away all his defenses. She loved art, flowers, things that had beauty in life, things my world had no place for. A profound sadness settled over Grace, heavy and chilling. His mother had been a casualty of the same dark world that had almost destroyed her. She understood. She remembered her own flight from that dark world, the terror of being a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "I know what that's like," she whispered, her own voice trembling with the echoes of her past. "To have everything you care about threatened by someone else's war. To try and run, to try and disappear." She paused, then found herself compelled to share, to reciprocate this unexpected vulnerability. "Before I worked at that restaurant, before Thorn, I lost my father too. Not to violence, but to despair. He lost everything because of a bad business deal, ruined by men with too much power. He simply gave up. And my mother, she just faded away after that. It was just me and Lily. and I swore I would never let anyone take away what little we had left. The confession hung in the air between them, two disparate souls connected by the shared weight of loss and the relentless shadow of powerful, dangerous men. Rogero watched her, his expression softening, almost imperceptibly, his gaze no longer just assessing, but seeing, understanding. The hardness around his eyes seemed to dissipate, replaced by something akin to shared sorrow. He slowly set the locket on the small table beside him, his hand lingering over it for a moment. Then his eyes met hers again, and in that long, silent gaze, Grace saw it, a raw, unprotected depth, a hidden ocean of pain and fierce, desperate loyalty. He wasn't just a powerful man, he was a man forged in fire, scarred by loss and driven by a primal need to protect what was his, to ensure no one else suffered the same fate. He raised his other hand, slowly, hesitantly. For a moment, Grace thought he might touch her, a fleeting thought that sent a jolt of pure, electric awareness through her veins. But his hand merely settled on the armrest of the chair, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him, the subtle tension in his muscles. It was a gesture of restraint, of unspoken longing. The air between them crackled, thick with a powerful, unspoken connection, a silent acknowledgement of the raw, fragile bond that had just been forged in the crucible of shared pain. The smell of whiskey and old leather, once acrid, now felt intimately entwined with his vulnerability. Grace felt a strange, intoxicating pull towards him, perilous attraction to the very darkness she had once feared. He was a dangerous man, yes, but she had just seen the cracks in his obsidian shield, glimpsed the human heart beating beneath the ruthless exterior. And in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her carefully constructed emotional walls were crumbling, giving way to an unexpected, profound connection. This shared moment of raw honesty, so rare and unexpected, deepened the hold he had over her, entwining her fate with his in a way she could never have anticipated. The golden cage now felt less like a prison and more like a fortress, protecting a secret intimacy she never thought she'd find. But what had happened when the world outside tried to breach these walls again and test the strength of this fragile, dangerous bond? The Ethelred Gallery, transformed for its annual charity gala, was a dazzling, cruel spectacle of light and sound. Crystal chandeliers, normally casting a serene glow, now blazed with 1,000 greedy eyes, reflecting off champagne flutes and diamond necklaces. The air hummed with superficial conviviality, a discordant symphony of forced laughter and sycophantic praise. Grace, once again in her charcoal uniform, felt like a ghost haunting a feast. Tonight, however, she wasn't just invisible. She felt impossibly exposed, as if every glittering eye could see the fear that gnawed at her, the precarious balance of her new, controlled existence. A subtle tremor ran through her as she walked past a group of art critics, their whispers like venomous insects. She tried to focus on the soft rustle of silk gowns, the clinking of silverware from the buffet, anything to drown out the internal clamor of her anxiety. The quiet sense of safety she'd found at Rogero's estate, that fragile, almost illicit comfort, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here, amidst the very people Thorn had manipulated with his insidious whispers, she was vulnerable again. She had glimpsed Rogero's dark power, seen his ruthless efficiency in action, and it had offered a profound, if terrifying, sense of security. But tonight, he was nowhere in sight, and the echoes of Thorn's past threats still rang in her ears, a chilling counterpoint to the festive music. The subtle scent of her own paint, clinging faintly to her clothes despite her efforts to wash it away, felt like a beacon, drawing unwanted attention. She clutched a tray of canapes, her knuckles white, her heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every averted gaze a judgment. She tried to project an aura of calm, of detachment, but inside, she was a coiled spring, taut with foreboding. Then the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A hush, subtle yet palpable, rippled through the crowd as Julian Thorn made his grand entrance. He wasn't merely walking. He was gliding, a dark, confident shark among glittering minnows. His bespoke tuxedo was pristine, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his smile a practiced, charming facade. But his eyes, those cheap whiskey eyes, immediately cut through the throng, locking onto Grace with a cold, triumphant glint. A wave of nausea washed over her, making the delicate canapes on her tray feel impossibly heavy. He hadn't forgotten. He wouldn't. He moved towards her with deliberate slowness, drawing out the tension. Each step was a hammer blow against Grace's rapidly diminishing composure. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the very anonymity she once resented. But there was nowhere to go. The opulent walls felt like a tightening vice, the glittering crowd a ring of silent, expectant spectators. The cloying scent of lilies, a large arrangement near her, suddenly felt suffocating, reminding her of Lily's fragility, her vulnerability, all tied to this man's malice. Thorne stopped barely a foot away, his imposing height casting a long shadow over her. "Grace, my dear," he purred, his voice oozing false sympathy, yet laced with an undeniable, sadistic edge. He raised his hand, not to touch her, but to casually pluck a miniature tart from her tray, his fingers brushing hers with a touch that made her recoil inwardly. "You look flustered." Unsurprising, given the circumstances. The crowd around them, drawn by his commanding presence and the sudden tension, began to gather, their whispers now more audible, more pointed. Grace's cheeks burned with shame. She could feel her palms growing damp, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. "Mr. Thorne," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, to project an air of professionalism she didn't feel. "I'm working. Is there something I can help you with?" His smile widened, a thin, cruel slash across his face. "Indeed, you can. You can help me clarify a few discrepancies." He raised his voice slightly, enough for it to carry over the ambient chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Grace Miller. A talented young woman, or so she claims. A meticulous restorer, or so some are led to believe." He paused, letting the words hang. Ripe with insinuation, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Eyes, once dismissive, were now sharp with curiosity, openly judging. Grace felt herself shrinking, her skin crawling under their collective gaze. Thorne was orchestrating a performance, and she was the unwilling star of his cruel drama. Recently, Thorne continued, his voice now ringing with feigned sorrow. "Several highly valuable, though minor pieces from my private collection had gone missing. Items that were, coincidentally, handled by Miss Miller during her restoration work for me, before her abrupt departure." He cast a pitying, yet damning, look at Grace. "And even more recently, a significant sum of money, intended for the charity tonight, vanished from the gallery's accounts. Money that, according to my sources, was routed to an offshore account. An account, I might add, that bears a striking resemblance to one used by Miss Miller's family to conceal certain financial indiscretions." Grace gasped, a choked sound of pure shock and disbelief. "That's a lie." Her voice, though raw and trembling, finally broke through, a desperate, pathetic cry against his calculated assault. "I didn't steal anything. I would never." Thorne merely chuckled, a soft, chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. He pulled a thick, official-looking envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "Proof, my dear. Irrefutable documentation. Bank statements. Authenticated transfer records. Even a signed confession, albeit from a former associate of yours, detailing your involvement." He held it up, a trophy in his manicured hand, for the crowd to see. "I was reluctant to expose such a fragile young woman. But integrity, especially in the art world, must be preserved. We cannot allow such blatant acts of theft and embezzlement to go unpunished, especially when they target charitable causes." The whispers erupted into an angry buzz. Disgusted glances, harsh murmurs of thief, disgrace, how could she, rained down on Grace like poison darts. Faces, once neutral, twisted into masks of disdain. She saw an older woman she'd served champagne to countless times recoil in disgust. A prominent art dealer she'd admired shook his head, look of profound disappointment on his face. She was utterly, irrevocably alone. The injustice of it all, the blatant fabrication, burned a scorching trail through her veins, but she was powerless, her voice drowned out by the rising tide of condemnation. Thorne, basking in the success of his demolition, leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear, laced with the smell of expensive whiskey. "And as for your little sister, Grace, without your income, how will she fare? Perhaps a public charity case? I'm sure a man like Conti wouldn't want such complications associated with his new acquisition." He smiled, a cold, triumphant flash of teeth. Then he did touch her, his fingers wrapping around her arm, a possessive, painful grip that dug into her flesh. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You belong to me, Grace. You always have. And now everyone will know it." Grace felt a dizzying wave of despair. Her reputation, her last shred of dignity, her fragile hope for Lily, all of it was being publicly, ruthlessly torn to shreds. She was a pariah, branded a thief, a liar, her past vulnerabilities weaponized against her. The air felt thin, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. The opulent gallery, once a symbol of impossible dreams, now felt like a gilded dungeon. Tears stung her eyes, blurring the faces of the judging crowd, turning them into grotesque caricatures. She was cornered, humiliated, utterly defeated. Her gaze, desperate and unfocused, swept across the crowd, a silent plea for someone, anyone, to believe her, to intervene. But there was no one. Just the turning backs, the cold stares, the condemnatory whispers. Her vision swam. The pain in her arm, Thorn's cruel grip, was a dull ache compared to the agonizing ache in her chest. She was utterly and terribly alone, cast out, her future shattered beyond repair. Just as Thorn's grip tightened, about to pull her closer, to seal her fate with another public indignity, a sudden, inexplicable shift rippled through the gallery. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through the murmuring crowd, silencing them once more. Grace, dazed with despair, barely registered it. But Thorn's triumphant smile faltered, his eyes narrowing, turning not to her, but to something or someone behind her. A new presence, colder, darker, more formidable, had just entered the room, radiating an unspoken threat that eclipsed even Thorn's venom. Grace's breath caught, a cold premonition seizing her. She didn't dare turn, but she knew. She felt it. The temperature had dropped, not from fear, but from the arrival of a force that was about to unleash a storm of its own. The gallery's opulent air, once suffocating with judgment, now crackled with an entirely different kind of tension. Grace, trembling under Julian Thorn's cruel grip, barely registered the shift, her world a dizzying haze of shame and despair. Her gaze was fixed on the accusing faces, the glittering contempt, the sheer crushing weight of public humiliation. Thorn's fingers dug into her arm, a possessive, painful vice, and his smirk promised utter annihilation. She was lost. Utterly, irrevocably lost. Then a sudden, almost supernatural stillness descended upon the room. The angry murmurs died. The clinking of glasses ceased. It wasn't merely silence. It was a vacuum, drawing all sound, all attention to a single point. Grace, dazed, felt Thorn's grip momentarily slacken, his head snapping up, his eyes widening in a flicker of confusion, then alarm. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a wave of shock washing over their faces. And then he was there. Rogero Conti. He didn't stride or walk with purpose. He simply existed at the edge of the gathering, an immutable, formidable presence that had materialized from the very fabric of the shadows. His bespoke dark suit, usually a statement of quiet power, now felt like a shroud of lethal intent. His obsidian eyes, usually cold and calculating, burned with an inferno of contained fury, a glacial fire that swept over the room, freezing every gaze, every breath. He was not merely a man. He was a force of nature, primal and terrifyingly precise. His gaze cut through the stunned crowd like a laser, bypassing everyone, every expensive artwork, every glittering jewel, and landing with chilling intensity directly on Grace. And more specifically, on Thorn's hand, still clutching her arm. It was a silent, lethal declaration, a boundary crossed, a transgression that would not be tolerated. Grace felt a jolt that went straight to her bones. Relief, pure and incandescent, flooded her. He was here. He saw. He knew. But beneath that soaring relief, a fresh wave of terror, cold and visceral, slammed into her. This wasn't just Rogero Conti, the detached billionaire, the demanding employer. This was something darker, more elemental. He was raw power personified, and the object of his fury was Thorn. And in that terrifying, exhilarating moment, Grace knew, with a certainty that made her heart hammer, that she was both saved and utterly, irrevocably claimed. Thorn, ever the opportunist, quickly recovered from his initial shock, though a bead of sweat now traced a path down his temple. Conti, he began, attempting a confident smirk, but his voice cracked slightly. A surprise. Come to witness the unraveling of your investment. His gaze, meant to be challenging, wavered under the relentless, silent heat of Rogero's stare. Rogero didn't acknowledge Thorn's words. He simply took a single, deliberate step forward, then another. His movements were slow, controlled, yet each stride felt like the inevitable march of destiny. The crowd parted before him like water, their faces a mixture of awe and stark fear. The air grew impossibly thick, suffocating with unspoken threat. When he stopped, he was barely 5 feet from Thorn and Grace. Close enough for Grace to feel the radiating heat of his anger, the barely contained violence simmering beneath his impeccable exterior. His eyes, still locked on Thorne's hand, were a silent promise of pain. "Release her." Rogero's voice finally cut through the tense silence. It wasn't a request. It was a command, low and gravelly, yet amplified by the sheer force of his will, reverberating through the vast gallery space. Each syllable was a hammer blow, striking at Thorne's brittle composure. Thorne, caught between his bravado and a burgeoning terror, hesitated, his eyes darting wildly. "Kanthi, I assure you this woman is a thief. I have proof. She has embezzled from me, from the gallery, from—" "I am aware of your accusations, Thorne," Rogero interrupted, his voice still low, but now laced with a chilling, metallic edge. "And I am aware of your proof." He paused, letting the implication hang, thick and heavy. "It is, shall we say, unconvincing." He then did something that sent a shiver of profound dread and exhilaration through Grace. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with a smooth, almost leisurely motion. The action was deceptively calm, yet it held the weight of an impending cataclysm. He pulled out a slender, black tablet and with a flick of his wrist, activated it. The screen glowed, displaying a series of complex legal documents, intricate flowcharts, and damning financial statements. As of precisely 7 minutes ago, Rogero announced, his voice carrying with effortless authority, cutting through the stunned silence. "Julian Thorne, you no longer own the Ethelred Gallery." A collective gasp, louder and more visceral than any before, erupted from the crowd. Thorne's face went white, his jaw dropping in disbelief, his grip on Grace's arm loosening. What were you saying?" he stammered, his voice thin, reedy. Rogero's gaze never left him. "I'm saying that through a series of entirely legal, if aggressively executed, transactions, the Kanthi Corporation has acquired all outstanding debts pertaining to your various enterprises, including but not limited to your personal loans, your silent partnerships, and the very ground this establishment stands upon." He paused, his lips curving into a ghost of a smile, cold and utterly devoid of mirth. "And your private collection, which, I might add, contains several pieces of dubious provenance, now subject to immediate forfeiture." Thorne stumbled back a step, releasing Grace's arm entirely. She felt a sudden, dizzying lightness, her arm throbbing, but the pain was a dull whisper compared to the thunderous shock reverberating through the room. The crowd was a tableau of disbelief, their eyes wide, their mouths agape. They understood the brutal, efficient finality of Kanthi's words. He hadn't just retaliated, he had annihilated. You can't," Thorne spluttered, his voice cracking with desperation. His eyes, now wide with abject terror, darted towards the documents on Rogero's tablet, then back to the implacable face of the billionaire. This is an act of war." Rogero's gaze sharpened, turning lethal. "It is an act of possession. You attempted to defame a member of my household. You threatened her. You touched what is mine." His voice dropped, a chilling growl that vibrated through Grace's very bones. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a flash of burning, possessive intensity that promised absolute protection and absolute ownership. In that moment, Grace felt a profound, primal shiver, a mix of sheer terror and exhilarating surrender. She was no longer just an employee or an artist. She was his. He looked back at Thorne, his expression a mask of cold, unyielding power. "You no longer own anything, Thorne. Not your reputation, not your assets, and certainly not the right to cast aspersions on those under my protection." Rogero then raised a single, imperious hand, making a slight, almost imperceptible gesture towards the back of the gallery. Before Thorne could utter another word, 2 impeccably dressed men, built like stone walls, emerged from the crowd, moving with silent, swift efficiency. They flanked Thorne, their faces utterly devoid of expression. Thorne, recognizing the silent, undeniable authority, tried to protest, to squirm, but he was no match for their controlled strength. They seized him, one on each arm, and began to steer him towards a discreet service exit at the rear of the gallery. "You will regret this, Kanthi," Thorne shrieked, his voice raw with impotent rage and burgeoning fear, his elegant facade crumbling into a grotesque mask of defeat. "This isn't over. You haven't heard the last." On the contrary, Thorne, Rogero's voice cut through his desperate cry, cold and absolute. "This is precisely where it ends. For you." And then, just as swiftly as he had appeared, Julian Thorne was gone, swallowed by the discreet exit, his pathetic protests fading into the general hum of shocked silence. The crowd, utterly stunned, stared at the space where Thorn had been, then slowly, hesitantly, turned their gazes back to Rogero Conthi. He stood there, a solitary, dominant figure in the heart of the opulent gallery, radiating an aura of complete and utter control. Grace, still reeling, felt a rush of adrenaline, a dizzying mix of relief and terror. The injustice, the humiliation, the sheer weight of Thorn's malice, it had all been swept away, not by justice, but by a raw, overwhelming display of power. Her knees felt weak, threatening to give out. She swayed, and a strong, steady hand instantly reached out, gripping her arm, not with Thorn's cruel possessiveness, but with a firm, protective strength that sent a jolt through her. Rogero Conthi. He hadn't taken his eyes off her since Thorn's departure. His face, still etched with a dangerous intensity, had softened only subtly. The anger was still there, but now it was directed outwards, a protective shield around her. "Are you harmed, Grace?" he asked, his voice low, a deep rumble that vibrated through her. The question was not a polite inquiry. It was a demand, a possessive assessment. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, still clouded with shock and lingering fear. The glittering chandeliers, the murmuring crowd, the expensive artwork, all faded into irrelevance. Only his dark, intense gaze mattered. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not harmed." His thumb, calloused yet gentle, brushed against her arm, where Thorn's fingers had dug in, as if erasing the trace of the unwanted touch. "Good," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her face, searching, assessing. His eyes, devoid of their usual coldness, now held an unyielding, fierce possessiveness that both terrified and profoundly reassured her. She was safe. Undeniably, absolutely safe. But she was also undeniably, absolutely his. And as Rogero Conthi tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her slightly closer, asserting his unspoken claim for all the stunned onlookers to witness, Grace knew, with a chill that was both delightful and terrifying, that her life had been irrevocably entwined with his dark, dangerous world. The rescue was complete, but the true implications of his vengeance and his ownership were only just beginning to unfold. The price of her safety was her very soul, offered willingly, if unconsciously, into his formidable hands. The opulent, glittering Ethelred gallery felt like a distant, distorted nightmare. The journey back to Rogero Conti's estate was a blur for Grace, a silent, surreal passage shrouded in the hum of the luxury car and the terrifying stillness of the man beside her. She had been physically unharmed, but the searing humiliation, Thorn's venomous words, and the crushing weight of public scorn had left invisible wounds, raw and bleeding. Her mind replayed the scene like a broken reel. Thorn's cruel smile, the accusing whispers, the sickening feeling of utter helplessness. And then Rogero. His silent, lethal appearance. His cold, brutal declaration of ownership. The memory of his eyes, burning with an inferno of possessive rage, sent a shiver through her that was a potent mix of fear and an undeniable, forbidden thrill. The moment they arrived at the estate, Rogero led her not to her suite, but directly to a quiet, dimly lit sitting room. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows, making the luxurious space feel intimate, almost cocoon-like. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort with words, but his presence was a solid, anchoring force in her swirling chaos. He pressed a glass of amber liquid into her trembling hand, whiskey, strong and biting, instantly warming her frozen insides. The scent of it mingled with the faint, masculine scent of his expensive cologne, a scent that was now inextricably linked with danger, power, and an unexpected, fierce protection. He sat opposite her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. There was no judgment, no demands, just a silent, unwavering observation. Grace found herself unable to meet his gaze for long, too aware of the raw emotions laid bare on her face. Her hands, still faintly trembling, clutched the glass. The silence stretched, heavy yet strangely comforting, allowing the adrenaline to slowly drain from her system, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Grace," he finally said, his voice the low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "Are you in pain?" She shook her head, her throat tight. "Not physically." A muscle in his jaw clenched, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. He stood, moving with that effortless, dangerous grace she was becoming accustomed to. He knelt before her, unexpected and utterly disarming. His powerful hands, the ones that could dismantle an empire with a single command, now gently took hers. His touch was firm, grounding, yet surprisingly tender. "He will never trouble you again," Rogero stated, his voice a quiet, chilling promise. "I ensured it." Grace looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only cold, unyielding resolve. She knew what ensured it meant in his world. Thorn wouldn't just be ruined. He would be utterly obliterated, removed from her path with the ruthless efficiency of a predator. The thought should have terrified her, should have repulsed her, but a dark, primal part of her found a strange, dangerous satisfaction in it. He had avenged her. He had protected her. He had claimed her. What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rogero's gaze hardened, a flicker of something intensely possessive in their depths. "That is not your concern. Your concern is your well-being. And your art." He released her hands, but his eyes never left hers. "He tried to break you, to make you believe you were worthless. He was wrong. You are far from it." His words, spoken with such quiet conviction, were a balm to her lacerated spirit. She realized then the true depth of his perception. He hadn't just seen the attack, he had seen the wound it inflicted. The shame, the despair, the fear of losing everything she fought for. And he had, in his own ruthless way, begun to mend it. Over the next few days, Grace found herself slowly, tentatively healing. Rogero didn't hover, but his presence was a constant, unwavering anchor. He arranged for a discreet therapist to visit, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, who helped Grace untangle the knots of shame and fear. He made sure her studio was always stocked with fresh canvases, rare pigments, and new tools, a silent encouragement for her art. He even brought her a small, delicate silver locket, strikingly similar to the one he kept for his mother, but with a small, unadorned canvas engraved on its surface. "For your art," he had said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "and for your courage." The gesture, so unexpected, had brought tears to her eyes. Their interactions in the studio shifted. The tension, while still present, was no longer solely born of apprehension, but of a different kind of awareness. A silent understanding, a deepening connection forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability. He would often watch her as she painted, his gaze intense, assessing, yet now laced with a possessive admiration that made her skin tingle. He started asking her about her techniques, about her inspirations, about the stories behind her art, questions that revealed a genuine curiosity beneath his formidable exterior. She found herself opening up, sharing fragments of her soul she had kept hidden for years, painting for him in a way she had never dared for anyone else. One afternoon, as she worked on a particularly intricate detail, Rogero approached her easel. He stood close, so close she could feel the subtle warmth radiating from his body, the faint, masculine scent of him wrapping around her. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "The art journal is running a new feature on your restoration work. Glowing. Thorn's old contacts are now praising your talent." Grace paused, her brush suspended midair. She didn't need to ask how this had happened. This was Rogero's quiet, devastating retribution, rebuilding her reputation piece by piece, ensuring that no shadow of Thorn's malice could ever touch her again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't reply verbally. Instead, his hand reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet intensely electric, sending a shiver down her spine. His dark eyes met hers, and in their depths, Grace saw not just protection, but a fierce, undeniable possessiveness, a hunger that both thrilled and terrified her. It was an unspoken declaration, a silent claim. Grace realized then, with a dizzying clarity, the truth of her feelings. Fear was still there, a lingering shadow, but it was now irrevocably intertwined with something else, a deep, profound respect, a powerful attraction, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. He had stepped into her abyss and pulled her out, not with gentle hands, but with a force that obliterated her tormentors. He was dangerous, ruthless, and utterly possessive. But he was her dangerous man. He saw her, protected her, and valued her in a way no one else ever had. The golden cage, once a symbol of her lost freedom, now felt like a sanctuary, a fortress built by a man who would burn the world to keep her safe. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment, accepting not just his protection, but his undeniable, encompassing claim. The unspoken promises hung in the air, thick and potent, a lifetime under his unwavering gaze, a future intertwined with his dark, formidable world. The wounds were healing, slowly, painfully, but with each passing day, She found herself falling deeper into the complex, dangerous embrace of Rogero Conti. The trauma of the gala was fading, replaced by the profound, unsettling reality of her new life. And she knew, with a certainty that thrilled her to her core, that the ultimate, unyielding price of her safety was a complete surrender to the man who now possessed her body and soul. What would that surrender truly mean? The answer, she knew, lay in the future, a future where her destiny was inextricably bound to his. The scent of turpentine and fresh linen now filled Grace's days, no longer a hidden secret but the very air of her existence. Her studio, a breathtaking, sun-drenched space Rogero had personally designed for her within the estate, was a sanctuary of creativity and peace. Walls of glass overlooked a meticulously landscaped garden, a living canvas of ever-changing hues. Here, amidst her brushes and pigments, Grace finally felt truly alive, her artistic spirit unfettered and soaring. Thorn was a ghost, a forgotten shadow banished from her life by Rogero's relentless power. Lily's medical bills were a concern of the past, her sister thriving under the best care money could buy, a direct result of Rogero's unwavering provision. Grace no longer wore the drab charcoal uniform. Her wardrobe, curated subtly by Rogero's discerning eye, consisted of elegant, comfortable clothes that hinted at her artistic flair while reflecting the sophisticated world she now inhabited. She moved through the estate with a quiet confidence, no longer an invisible assistant but the cherished mistress of the house, her presence an undeniable, central force in Rogero's formidable world. The staff, once distant and formal, now met her gaze with respectful warmth, understanding her unique position. Her art, nurtured by unwavering support and endless resources, had blossomed. Her canvases, once filled with muted tones and hidden anxieties, now exploded with vibrant colors and bold, confident strokes. She painted landscapes that pulsed with life, portraits that captured raw emotion, and abstracts that danced with intricate beauty. Rogero was often her silent audience, sitting in a leather armchair in her studio, his gaze intense, possessive, yet always filled with an undeniable admiration that made her heart swell. He understood her art, saw the depths of her soul in every brushstroke, and cherished it fiercely. Their relationship had evolved into a complex tapestry of unspoken understandings and profound connection. The initial fear of his ruthless power had transformed into a deep, abiding trust. The possessiveness that had once unnerved her now felt like a warm, encompassing embrace, a shield against a world she no longer had to face alone. He was still the dangerous, formidable Rogero Conti, capable of chilling acts of power, but for her, he was also the unwavering protector, the discerning connoisseur of her soul, the silent force that had plucked her from the abyss and given her wings. One crisp autumn morning, as Grace was meticulously applying the finishing touches to a new portrait of Lily, her sister's face glowing with health and happiness, Rogero entered the studio. He wore a dark, casual sweater that emphasized the powerful lines of his body, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. He stopped behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall against her back. The faint scent of leather and his unique masculine cologne enveloped her, a scent that now symbolized absolute safety. He didn't speak, just watched over her shoulder as her brush completed the final detail. Grace felt his warm breath on her hair, the subtle tremor that ran through her whenever he was this close. Finishing the stroke, she leaned back, admiring her work. "It is exquisite, Grace," Rogero murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "You have captured her light." "She has always been my light," Grace replied softly, turning to face him. Her eyes, filled with a newfound peace and confidence, met his dark, intense gaze. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin with a tenderness that sent shivers through her. "And you, Grace Miller," he said, his voice deepening, "are mine. My light, my art, my stolen canvas, finally where it belongs." Her breath hitched. The words, so possessive, yet so deeply tender, resonated deep within her soul. He wasn't just claiming her body or her talent. He was claiming her very essence, her spirit, her place in his world. And she, astonishingly, wanted nothing more than to be claimed by him. "I am," she whispered, leaning into his touch, her eyes brimming with unshed tears of overwhelming happiness. "Completely. And you are mine, Rogero Conti." A rare, soft smile, a genuine curve of his lips that transformed his formidable face into something breathtakingly human, touched his mouth. He leaned down slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that was both fierce and infinitely tender. It was a kiss of triumph, a belonging, a promises whispered in the silent language of their souls. his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against his strong body, a protective embrace that promised forever. She tangled her fingers in his soft, dark hair, returning his kiss with all the love and gratitude that swelled in her heart. The past, with its shadows and its pain, no longer held dominion over her. Julian Thorne was a vanquished memory, his world systematically dismantled by Rogero, leaving no trace of his venomous influence. Rogero had ensured it, with cold, precise finality that Grace, despite her inherent gentleness, understood and accepted. He had cleansed her world, not with violence against her, but with an overwhelming force that eliminated anyone who dared to threaten what was his. Their life together settled into a beautiful, protective rhythm. They traveled to secluded villas, where Grace would set up her easel overlooking breathtaking landscapes, Rogero always nearby, working discreetly from his secure office, his presence a constant, comforting anchor. He delighted in her creativity, providing her with every possible resource, every inspiration, but never seeking to control her artistic vision. He wanted her to flourish, to truly live, under his unwavering gaze. Grace learned to navigate his world, understanding its complexities, its subtle dangers, but always within the secure boundaries he had built around her. She no longer had to be invisible. She was seen, truly seen, by the only man who mattered. She found joy in the simple things. Morning coffee with Rogero on a sun-drenched terrace, the quiet rustle of his turning pages as she painted, the comforting weight of his hand in hers during their evening walks. Lily often visited, her laughter filling the grand estate, a testament to the new life Grace had built. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues that mirrored one of Grace's canvases, they sat together on a balcony, watching the world turn. Rogero's arm was around her, holding her close, her head resting against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Leaving that world behind? Your empire?" He paused, a long, thoughtful silence stretching between them. Then he tightened his arm, pulling her even closer. "My empire was built on shadows, Grace," he murmured, his voice deep and resonant. "It was a monument to a past I no longer desired. You showed me a different canvas, a brighter one." He turned his head, his lips brushing her temple. "I don't regret it. Not for a single moment. I gave up a kingdom to claim my queen. And you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "are the most valuable acquisition I have ever made. My priceless, stolen canvas, finally and forever mine." Grace smiled, a profound, serene happiness blossoming in her chest. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce it almost hurt. His possessiveness, his danger, his unwavering, absolute claim, it was all part of the man who had loved her from the shadows, protected her with ruthless efficiency, and finally opened his guarded heart to her. She was not just safe, she was cherished, adored, and utterly, irrevocably belonged. In his arms, under his dark, possessive gaze, Grace Miller, the vanishing artist, had found her true masterpiece, a life of boundless love, absolute safety, and a future where she would never, ever be invisible again. Have you ever felt truly invisible, desperately fighting for a life you barely control? Grace, our vanishing artist, believed her worth was tied to her struggles, her past pain, and the shadows that consumed her. But her story teaches us that true value isn't defined by what you endure, but by the unwavering light within you, waiting to be seen. Rogero's love wasn't about control. It was a fierce, healing force that saw beyond her scars, offering a sanctuary where she could finally bloom. It showed her that even the darkest protectors can harbor the purest intentions, willing to move heaven and earth for the one they claim. You too deserve a love that sees your hidden canvas, a partner who will move mountains to ensure your safety and fiercely cherish your soul. Your vulnerabilities are not weaknesses. They're the cracks where light gets in. If Grace's journey resonated with the longing in your heart today, hit that like button. Subscribe to join our community of resilient souls. And tell us in the comments, "I am seen,